What's up guys, Mohammad Farhan Labib here, a second year MBBS student at JMC Guwahati. So in this video we will talk in detail about blood pressure. So let's get started. So in this video we will talk about the blood pressure, the definition of blood pressure, the different types of blood pressure, and at last we will talk about the most important regulation of blood pressure. So give heading blood pressure. The points we are going to cover is what? Number one, the definition, types, alright, then we will talk about the regulation. Okay guys, so let's dive into the topic, the definition of blood pressure. What is blood pressure? Blood pressure is the lateral pressure which is exerted by blood on the vessel wall. It is a lateral pressure exerted by blood on vessel wall. Okay, so now guys, what are the different types of the blood pressure? Number one is the systolic blood pressure. Systolic blood pressure is the maximum pressure exerted by blood during systole. Maximum pressure exerted, maximum pressure exerted by blood during what? During systole. Hence it is known as systolic blood pressure. Alright guys, so what is the normal range of blood pressure? The normal range is from 90 to 140 millimeter of mercury. Though we say that the normal blood pressure is 120 millimeter of mercury, but if we talk about the range, the actual range varies from 90 to 140 millimeter of mercury. Alright. So what is the another type of blood pressure? The another type of blood pressure is the diastolic blood pressure. It is the minimum pressure exerted by blood on its wall, on vessel wall during what? Diastole. The most important point to be noted is it is the minimum pressure exerted by blood on vessel wall during what? During diastole. Talking about arteries, normal range, the normal range of the diastolic blood pressure on the aorta ranges from 60 to 90 millimeter of mercury. Though we say that the diastolic blood pressure is 80 millimeter of mercury, but talking about the range, it varies from 60 to 90 millimeter of mercury. Right guys, so now what is pulse pressure? The pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure. As BP minus dBp is nothing but pulse pressure. So what is the pulse pressure's value? If we take systolic blood pressure as 120 and diastolic as 40, then it comes out to be 40 millimeter of mercury guys. Okay, so now pulse pressure can also be written as a ratio, or instead of writing it as a ratio, we can say that the pulse pressure is directly proportional to the stroke volume and it is inversely proportional to the compliance of the aorta, compliance of the vessel, or if we take the vessel as aorta, then it is inversely proportional to the compliance of the aorta. Okay, so if stroke volume increases, then that will signify that the pulse pressure will increase. So what are the condition in which the stroke volume is more? The condition is like aortic regurgitation. Aortic regurgitation. What is the reason guys? In aortic regurgitation, we know that the vessel, the valves, the semilunar valves is not properly closed. Now if the semilunar valves is not properly closed, then the blood can again re-enter the ventricle, increasing the end-diastolic volume, and if the end-diastolic volume increase, in that case the stroke volume will increase. It's as simple as that. Now the stroke volume, in case the stroke volume is less, then the pulse pressure will also be less because they are directly proportional. Now what is the condition in which the stroke volume is less guys? That condition, clinical condition, is aortic stenosis. Okay, it's simple. If there is aortic stenosis, aortic valve stenosis, in that case what will happen? The stroke volume will definitely decrease, and this will decrease the pulse pressure as well. Similarly, if there is decreased compliance of the vessel, then there will be increased pulse pressure. What is that condition? That condition is arteriosclerosis. Because if there is sclerosis of the artery or the aorta actually, then what will happen? The compliance of the aorta will decrease, and in that case the pulse pressure will obviously increase. And if there is increase in compliance, then there is decrease in pulse pressure, because they're inversely related, guys. Okay, so now write systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and pulse pressure. Now what does systolic blood pressure depend on, and what is it produced by? Let us talk about first what is systolic blood pressure produced by. The systolic blood pressure is produced by the ventricular contraction. Very obvious. As the ventricles will pump, then that will produce a pressure known as the systolic blood pressure. And what is it maintained by, guys? The systolic blood pressure is maintained by the cardiac output. This is also very obvious. Now let us move on to the diastolic blood pressure. During the diastole, we know that the semilunar valves are closed. So what is the diastolic blood pressure produced by? It is produced by the elastic recoil, guys. Elastic recoil of aorta. Elastic recoil of aorta. And what is it maintained by? The diastolic blood pressure is, on the other hand, maintained by the total peripheral resistance. Okay, and the pulse pressure, basically, since it is directly proportional to the stroke volume, so it is basically concerned with the stroke volume. So these are some of the high yielding points about the blood pressures which you need to remember. Now let us move on to the next sort of the blood pressure, that is the mean arterial blood pressure. It is the average blood pressure during the entire circulation in the vessel. Average pressure during circulation in vessel. And this mean arterial blood pressure is equal to the diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. Now if we kind of put the values, pulse pressure is equal to what? Systolic blood pressure minus what? Diastolic blood pressure. Okay, now what does it come out to be? Diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the systolic blood pressure minus 1/3 of the diastolic blood pressure. What does it come out to be? It comes out to be 2/3 of the diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the systolic blood pressure. So we've got two formulas here. Number one formula is the mean arterial pressure is equal to diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. Number two formula is what? Number two formula is mean arterial pressure is equal to 2/3 of the diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the systolic blood pressure. So if we talk about the dependence of the mean arterial blood pressure, it is more dependent on the diastolic blood pressure rather than the systolic blood pressure. More dependence on what? Diastolic blood pressure as compared to that of the systolic blood pressure. Now what is its normal range, guys? The normal range of the mean arterial pressure comes out to be in the range of from 99 millimeter of mercury to 100 millimeter, 95 millimeter of mercury to 100 millimeter of mercury. How do we get the value, guys? If we equate, or if we put the values of diastolic blood pressure, which is 80 plus 1/3 of what? Pulse pressure, which is 40, it comes out to be 93.3. So the normal range is taken in the range of 95 to 100 millimeter of mercury, guys. Okay, so this was all about the different types of blood pressure and their definitions. Number one, we talked about systolic blood pressure, then we talked about diastolic blood pressure, we talked about pulse pressure, we talked about the maintenance and production of these pressures, and then we moved on to the mean arterial blood pressure, guys. Now let us talk about the very important topic, which is what? The regulation of blood pressure. Regulation of blood pressure. So talking about the regulation of blood pressure, guys, we have two sorts of regulation. Number one is short-term regulation. Okay, and number two is long-term regulation. Long-term regulation of the blood pressure is basically concerned with RAS, renin, aldosterone, angiotensin system. Okay, so this is basically discussed in more detail in the kidney chapter or the excretion chapter. In this particular chapter, we'll be mostly concerned with the short-term regulation, guys. So talking about short-term regulation, we have two important things to know in short-term regulation, that is the vasomotor center and the cardiac vagal center, or also known as the cardiac inhibitory center. Now what are the components of this vasomotor center? The components of this vasomotor center are three actually. Number one is the nucleus tractus solitarius, which is the sensory part actually. Next we have the chordoventrolateral medulla. Chordo refers to the head, towards the head, okay. And then we have the chordo refers to, means chordo actually refers towards the tail, not towards the head. Chordo refers towards the tail. And the other one is what? Rostroventrolateral medulla. Rostroventrolateral medulla. Rostro means towards the head, okay guys. Rostro means towards the head and chordo means towards the tail, guys, okay. So the three components of the vasomotor center is number 1 nucleus tractus solitarius, number 2 chordoventrolateral medulla, and number 3 rostroventrolateral medulla, out of which the rostroventrolateral medulla is the most important one. Rostroventrolateral medulla is the most important one, and this chordoventrolateral medulla sends inhibitory neurons to the rostroventrolateral medulla. Actually, we will discuss in detail about this stuff shortly, okay. So at this point of time, just remember that the chordoventrolateral medulla inhibits the rostroventrolateral medulla, and this chordoventrolateral medulla is also known as depressor area. Since it is inhibiting, so it is also known as the depressor area, and the rostroventrolateral medulla is known as the pressor area. So guys, if the inhibition to the VMC is less, this will lead to what? Increase in the blood pressure. And if the inhibition to the VMC is more, then this will lead to the fall in the blood pressure. Which blood pressure? Mean arterial blood pressure. We'll talk in detail about this shortly. Just remember at this point of time, if the inhibition to the vasomotor center is less, then this will lead to the increase in the blood pressure, mean arterial blood pressure. And if the inhibition to the vasomotor center is more, then obviously there will be decrease in the mean arterial blood pressure. And guys, if we are talking about this cardiac vagal center, it is also present in the medulla. It is also present in the medulla, and that is basically what? Nucleus ambiguous. The detailed structure of where the nucleus ambiguous is present will be talked in detail in the anatomy part, neuroanatomy part. Physiology doesn't deal with it, okay. All right guys, so now let us talk about what is this VMC and CVC controlled by. This VMC and CVC is controlled and regulated by baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. Baroreceptors and chemoreceptors, okay. So guys, here I have taken up an image from the Guyton showing the chordoventrolateral medulla, rostroventrolateral medulla, and the cardiac inhibitory center. See, here they have labeled vasoconstrictor area. This vasoconstrictor area is nothing but the rostroventrolateral medulla, and here they have marked the vasodilator area, which is nothing but what? It is nothing but chordo, means towards the tail, chordoventrolateral medulla, and they have also marked the cardio inhibitory center, which is nothing but the nucleus ambiguous, guys. Okay, now the pictorial representation is also clear. Now let us move on to what? Now let us move on to the baroreceptor mechanism in detail. Baroreceptor mechanism. Give the heading baroreceptors. Talking about baroreceptors, first of all, we should know what is the location of these baroreceptors. Okay, location of these baroreceptors. These baroreceptors are actually located, number 1, in the aortic arch, and number 2 in the carotid, and number 2 in what? The carotid body. Okay, so guys, so now this aortic arch is innervated by which nerve? 10th cranial nerve, and this carotid body is innervated by the 9th cranial nerve. Okay, so here in this diagram we can easily see, this diagram has again been taken from where? The Guyton. You can see easily that this is the aortic arch, okay, and from this aortic arch the aortic baroreceptors are present, and this from aortic baroreceptors 10th cranial nerve is supplying them, as we have already written, 10th cranial nerve. And this is eventually going into what? This is eventually going into the VMC, which we will shortly see how does it go into the VMC. And next, if we talk about another baroreceptor which is present at the carotid body, okay, this is supplied by the 9th cranial nerve. 9th cranial nerve. This 9th cranial nerve has got a branch called as the herring nerve. So specifically talking, this carotid body is supplied by the herring nerve, which is a branch of the 9th cranial nerve, or also known as the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay guys, now let us say what is the pressure range, the pressure range at which this baroreceptors work. The pressure range is actually from a 60 not from 60 millimeter of mercury to 180 millimeter of mercury. Therefore, if the mean arterial blood pressure varies from 60 to 180 millimeter of mercury, that is, if the mean arterial blood pressure is in the range of 60 to 180 millimeter of mercury, only then the baroreceptors can act. All right. So 60 millimeter of mercury acts as what? Acts as a threshold for baroreceptors, and 180 millimeter of mercury is the maximum stimulation of the baroreceptors. So if we plot it in the form of graph, let us consider that this is 60 millimeter of mercury, and this is, let us consider that 180 millimeter of mercury. 180 millimeter of mercury. This is what, remember guys, this is mean arterial blood pressure. This is not normal blood pressure. This is the mean arterial blood pressure. Okay. So mean arterial blood pressure of 60 millimeter of mercury to 180 millimeter of mercury is the range for the action of baroreceptor. But we know that normal mean arterial blood pressure is what? 100 millimeter of mercury. So if the if our mean arterial blood pressure exceeds normal, then the baroreceptor will act and will correct it. Similarly, if the mean arterial blood pressure falls below the normal, then the baroreceptor can act and and it can easily increase it. Now let us talk about what the mechanism of the action of baroreceptor. How does the baroreceptor stimulate the vasomotor center, and how does the baroreceptor stimulate the cardiac vagal center or the cardiac inhibitory center, and how does the actual stuff work? Let us talk in detail. Okay guys, so let us consider a situation where the mean arterial blood pressure has exceeded 100 millimeter of mercury. Then what will happen? This will basically stimulate the baroreceptors. All right, and from the baroreceptors, the 9th cranial nerve and the 10th cranial nerve, 9th cranial nerve and 10th cranial nerve will carry this information toward the nucleus tractus solitarius, which is basically what? The sensory part, as we have already written here. The nucleus tractus solitarius was what? Was at the sensory part. Okay, so from the nucleus tractus solitarius, what will happen? From the nucleus tractus solitarius has got what? Stimulated now. Now from this nucleus tractus solitarius, it will stimulate what? The cordoventrolateral medulla, which is nothing but the depressor area. Alright guys, but we know that the cordoventrolateral medulla has got GABAergic neurons in it. So these GABAergic neurons will now inhibit what? Inhibit the rostroventrolateral medulla. Rostroventrolateral medulla, which is the main part of the vasomotor center. Now upon inhibition of the rostroventrolateral medulla, which is also known as which part? The pressor area. Now since the pressor area has got inhibited, therefore the sympathetic flow will decrease. This will decrease the sympathetic flow. Sympathetic flow will decrease. Now the decrease in the sympathetic flow will decrease the heart rate, will decrease the stroke volume, will decrease cardiac output, will decrease the blood pressure eventually. So the increase in the mean arterial blood pressure has now led to the decrease in the mean arterial blood pressure. Alright guys, another thing that the nucleus tractus solitarius will do is it will also inhibit, since the blood pressure has increased, so it will stimulate the cardiac vagal center or the cardiac inhibitory center, which is nothing but what guys? Which is nothing but your nucleus ambiguous, which is present in the medulla again, and this will increase the parasympathetic flow, and this increase in the parasympathetic flow will again decrease the heart rate guys. So this is how the baroreceptors basically work. Okay, if there is increase in the blood pressure, eventually we have achieved what? The decrease in the blood pressure. Similarly, if there is decrease in the mean arterial blood pressure, we will eventually end up getting increase in the mean arterial blood pressure. But this mechanism works under which range guys? From the 60 millimeter of mercury to 180 millimeter of mercury. From 60 millimeter of mercury to what? 180 millimeter of mercury. Similar is the action of the chemoreceptor. The chemoreceptors also act in the same way, but the only difference is their range of action. The range of action varies from 40 to 60 millimeter of mercury guys. 40 to 60 millimeter of mercury of which pressure? Or the mean arterial blood pressure. I'm again stressing the fact It is what? Mean arterial blood pressure. It is not normal blood pressure. It is not systolic blood pressure, or not the diastolic blood pressure, not the pulse pressure. It is what? It is a mean arterial blood pressure. Okay. Now again, talking about location, the location also varies slightly. The location is present in what? The aortic body, not aortic body, aortic sinus actually. Aortic sinus and what? Carotid sinus. The earlier one was present at what body? That is, the baroreceptors were present in the body and the chemoreceptors are present in the sinus, guys. Okay, so the only difference lies in the range of action and their location. Rest all the mechanisms are similar. And another thing to note is their range of action, that is 40 to 60 millimeter of mercury. Since they act between 40 to 60 millimeter of mercury, therefore the action that they will do is always increase in the BP, increase in the mean arterial blood pressure. Why? Because we know that the normal mean arterial blood pressure is how much? 100 millimeter of mercury. So if the blood pressure falls between 40 to 60 millimeter of mercury, there is no other option left but to increase the BP. So the eventual goal for the chemoreceptor is always to what? Increase the mean arterial blood pressure. So this is another thing which you need to remember, guys. So that was all about short-term regulation. We can also have some extra influence on this vasomotor center from the cerebral cortex, and it can also be stimulated by the hippocampus, not hippocampus, hypothalamus, I'm so sorry, hypothalamus. And this hypothalamus can again be stimulated by pain afferents, which we will learn in CNS. Okay, they can also be stimulated by the limbic system when we have emotional stress. When guys, when we are suffering from emotional stress, we see that there is a rise in the BP, and this is due to the effect of the limbic system on the hypothalamus, which stimulates the vasomotor center. And the another thing is the position, the receptors which are present in the joints, joint proprioceptors. So guys, whenever we exercise, what happens is, these proprioceptors which are present in the joints will increase the blood pressure by stimulating the vasomotor center, guys. So that was all about short-term regulation. Now let us talk about what? Long-term regulation of blood pressure, which is nothing but RAS, renin, aldosterone, angiotensin mechanism, guys. So for understanding this, let us first of all draw a cross section at the level of the distal convoluted tubule of the nephron. All right, so if we draw a cross section of the distal convoluted tubule at the level of the distal convoluted tubule of the nephron, let us consider that this is the afferent arteriole, and this is the efferent arteriole, and this is the glomerular capillaries. So we will see that the myoepithelial cells which are present at the afferent arteriole undergo some modification, which are in close association with this distal convoluted tubule. This is what? Distal convoluted tubule. So this DCT, there are some close to this DCT, there are some myoepithelial cells which undergoes modification to form which cells? To form the JG cells, or the juxtaglomerular cells. Guys, this juxtaglomerular cells produces a hormone called as renin. Okay, now what are the conditions under which this renin will be produced? The conditions in which this renin will be produced is decrease in blood pressure, whenever there is fall in blood pressure, whenever there is hypovolemia, okay, whenever there is edema can be seen in case of congestive cardiac failure, they can be seen in case of liver cirrhosis, okay, similarly in burns. Alright guys, so these are the conditions where the renin will be produced. Now what will this renin do? This renin will act on liver angiotensinogen, and it will convert this angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. Alright, now this angiotensin 1 is acted upon by angiotensin converting enzyme, which is present in the lung capillaries. Okay, this will convert into what? Angiotensin 2. And this angiotensin 2 is a potent vasoconstrictor. It will also increase salt and water retention from the nephrons. Another effect which it will have is what? This will increase the production of aldosterone, and this will again increase salt and water retention. So all this combined effect will lead to increase in BP. Now guys, why was renin produced? Renin was produced due to fall in BP or hypovolemia, which will again lead to the fall in BP. Okay guys, edema, burns, dehydration, these are the conditions under which renin was produced. And what is the goal which we are getting? We are getting increase in the BP. So it was produced due to fall in the BP, and eventually what we have achieved is increase in the BP. So this is how long-term regulation of blood pressure is carried out. So that's it guys. That was all about blood pressure guys. If you found the video to be useful, share it with your friends and help this channel grow. Thank you.